Marriage Today presents Affair-Proofing Your Marriage, Part 1 by Jimmy Evans.
This message today is called Affair-Proofing Your Marriage. And this is a two-part message. I'm beginning it this week, and I'll finish it next weekend. And this is obviously a very important topic, and I want to say right up front concerning this topic that, the statistics vary, and I've studied the statistics for many years. Somewhere between a third and a half of all marriages will be affected by this, infidelity. And so if this room is, proportionate to those statistics, a lot of the couples, a lot of families in here have been affected by this. It may have been in a previous relationship. It may be in your current marriage. It could be that the circumstances are brewing in your relationship, and this message will help to prevent something from happening. But I always want to say, last week when I was talking about divorce-proofing your marriage, I always want to begin by talking about the grace of God, because I don't want this message to put a finger in a wound in your life and just stir things up. The devil comes to us, we're all fallible human beings, and the devil comes to us and tempts us to do the wrong thing. And once we do it, he condemns us and tells us we can never be forgiven. And I want you to know that you can be forgiven of God. If you've made a mistake in your past, you can be forgiven by God. And many of you have been forgiven by God. And when God forgives, he doesn't kind of forgive, he forgives. And he forgets. As far as the east is from the west, he puts it away. And the Bible says that one of the greatest men in human history, a man named King David, made a horrible mistake. And he committed adultery with a woman named Bathsheba, even killed her husband, or had her husband killed. And they got married later, they had a baby, and God ultimately redeemed that circumstance, but out of a lot of pain. And so, but by the grace of God, this could happen to any person. It could happen to any couple. And I'm not saying that to justify anything. I'm just saying it so the devil doesn't take any opportunity in this message to condemn or to hurt in any way those of you who may be hurting already and those of you who are vulnerable in this area. The devil's an evil devil, but God is a good God. And our God is a forgiving, gracious God. And my prayer is that for those of you who have been maybe, this has happened to you in your past, that this would help you heal. And for those of you who have not had this happen, that it will help you to build an affair-proof relationship where you can close the door on the devil in your relationship, as well as those who've had this happen in the past, and maybe you want to understand how it happened. Affair-proofing your marriage. Now, we are created to bond with one person of the opposite sex in marriage for a lifetime. And anything that disrupts that, it just simply doesn't work. And let me just talk about jealousy for just a minute, because jealousy is a very important emotion in marriage, and it's a very positive emotion in marriage. It can become destructive if it's unhealthy and extreme, but it's a God-like emotion. And here's what Exodus 34:14 says about God. Stay in Hebrews 13 if you would. The Lord, whose name is jealous. Look at that. The Lord, whose name is jealous, is a jealous God. A lot of times when we're repeating the names of God, we forget that one of his names is jealous. And the word jealous means intolerant of rivalry. You're jealous because you love somebody. Now, again, jealousy can be destructive and petty. But in marriage, we're jealous because we love our spouse. God is jealous because of how much he loves us. He won't give us up easily. He's intolerant of rivalry with things or people or anything like that because he loves us so much. His jealousy is a sign of his love, and that's what happens in marriage. We marry and we love each other. We want to have a good marriage. The first thing that jealousy does is it protects the priority of the relationship. God said, for this cause a man shall leave his father and mother and cleave unto his wife. You leave your father and mother, your blood kin. The most important relationship you have in life, you've got to reprioritize that in order to enter into marriage. Marriage has to be before your children, before your work, before church. Not before God, but before church. It has to be before everything or it doesn't work. And if in marriage we begin to put our spouse at a lesser priority, they'll become jealous. If we begin to put God behind other things, he becomes jealous because he wants first place. Our marriage has to be first place except for our relationship with God, or our spouse is going to get jealous. Another thing that jealousy does is it protects the relational integrity of the relationship. If you see your spouse behaving in an inappropriate manner with someone else of the opposite sex or whatever, you become jealous because you're flirting, you're talking to them in inappropriate ways, you're doing things, you're crossing a line. So jealousy protects the relational appropriateness of the relationship. And again, I want to say it's a very, very important emotion for us, and it ultimately protects the marriage relationship if you listen to it, if you pay attention to it. Adultery defined, or an affair defined, is taking the most sacred expressions of intimacy in marriage and giving them to someone other than your spouse. Now, you can have an affair without having sex. You can have an affair on an emotional level. And I'll talk about that in this message a lot. It's giving what belongs only to my spouse and taking that and giving it to someone else. Adultery is almost always preceded by a loss of priority and relational integrity. And adultery is almost always preceded by the jealousy of a spouse. In other words, the warning light on the dash was going off. There was something happening. There was inappropriate behavior, a loss of priority, a distraction, a detachment that was going on. And then adultery happened. And adultery is an epidemic in our society. And I want to talk about the 4 foundations of an affair-proof marriage in this message and the next message. In this message, I only want to talk about emotional foundations, building strong emotional foundations. When you have an affair, it's not just in the physical arena. That's kind of what we think about. It's in the mental, emotional, spiritual, and physical arenas. And so there's an emotional aspect to it. And I'm going to talk about the other areas in next week's message, in the next message. But in this one, I want to talk about the emotional aspect of it. And I want to tell you 2 secrets, 2 keys to building an emotionally strong marriage that's affair-proof. And then the first is a decision to never turn our hearts away from our spouse. A covenant decision never to turn your heart from your spouse. And I want to explain this. So this is Hebrews 13, where I ask you to turn. Verse 4, marriage is honorable among all. Now, by the way, it is not honorable among all. Many people in the world today dishonor marriage. What the writer of Hebrews is saying here is it should be honorable among God's people. And the bed undefiled. The marriage bed should be undefiled by sexual sin. But fornicators and adulterers God will judge. And it's talking about if they don't repent, okay? If you don't repent, there's going to be a judgment. Let your conduct be without covetousness. Be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I will never leave you nor forsake you. Well, let me go back through this. God himself, now this is all one thought now. These are not separated scriptures with separated thoughts. All of this has to do with having a marriage where you have an honorable marriage and the marriage bed is undefiled. Okay, the writer of Hebrews says, God himself has said to us, his people, I will never physically desert you and I will never turn my heart away from you. The word forsake means turn your heart away. So you can be sitting right next to a person that you've turned your heart away from. You're together in the car, you're together at home, you're together right here, right now, but your heart is far away. God says to us, I'll never do that. I promise you, on your worst day, when you've done the worst thing you could ever do, as my people, I promise I will never physically desert you and I will never turn my heart away. I'll never be distracted from you. When you pray, I hear. When you hurt, I care. When you have a need, I'm sensitive to that. I will never turn my heart away from you. Somebody needs to say amen, because that's good news. Okay, now the statement before that was, don't covet. Don't be covetous and be content with such things as you have. For he himself has said, I'll never leave you or forsake you. What's the point? The reason we turn our hearts away from each other is because we become offended at each other. You know, every time something happens in the relationship, every time you do something that I don't like, the devil's always there to accuse us to each other and to create an offense so that we turn our hearts away. I'm still in the marriage, but my heart is turned away. You know, you used to be skinny and sweet, and now you're flabby and naggy. You know? So yeah, you know, I did love you, 50 pounds ago. Karen can still get into her clothes that we got married in, and I was 155 pounds. We got married, and I weigh like 163 now. I totally resent that laughter. But you've changed. You're different. Yeah, sure, I loved you back then. You smelled better. But now look at you. Yeah, I'm shopping. I've turned my heart away. I'm leaning away from the marriage. I'm different than I used to be because you're different than you used to be. Oh, really? Okay. Well, that's a lot different than God. Because see, covenant means this. I am permanently committed regardless of what changes. I'm in day one, and this is not a conditional commitment based on what you do or do not do in the future. This is an all-in commitment, and I'm saying two things to you right up front when I put this ring on your finger. I will never leave you or turn my heart away from you. I will never do that. That's what God says. He's a covenant God, and He wants a covenant people. And marriage is a covenant relationship. And if you've got one foot out the back door with your heart turned away and you're shopping, you're set up for an affair. The only way you can close the door on it is to say, I will never leave you or forsake you. I'm in this thing for good. So Karen and I were on Dennis Rainey's radio program a few years ago, and he has a program on marriage, a radio program, very good ministry. And we were being interviewed by him, and so he asked me some questions, and he turned to Karen and started interviewing her. And he went back because he was referring to Marriage on the Rock, the book, and he said, well, Karen, Jimmy was really a jerk when y'all first got married. They were talking about me like I wasn't there. You know, like, well, whatever, Jack. But, so, Jimmy was a real jerk when y'all first got married. Karen, yeah, he really was. She was a little too animated, about, yeah, he really was. And so he asked her this question. He said, were you ever tempted to have an affair back in those days? And I thought, well, I want to know. And she said this to him, I wouldn't let my heart go there. And she meant it. See, forsaking means I've taken up an offense against you, or I have heard a seductive voice offer me something better than you, and I turned. On the inside, I turned. See, God says He'll never do that. When we say our vows getting married, here's what the vows sound like, something like this. For better, for worse, for richer, for poor, in sickness and in health, to love and to cherish, till death do us part. Those are covenant vows. The devil comes to us in worse and sicker and poorer. And in those circumstances, he begins to advertise others and offend us toward our spouse. And that's when we're most vulnerable to turning our heart away. And it's in those times that we have to make the covenant decision, I will never. And let me say something to some of you who may be younger. The best times in marriage come after you've gone through some of those poor and sicker and worse times. And you stayed together and you worked on your marriage and you come out the other side stronger, better, closer, more in love. And there's no trust on earth like the trust you have for a person who had the reason to leave but didn't. Who had a reason to turn their heart away but didn't. There's a psychiatrist, Dr. Gail Saltz, and she shares advice on emotional affairs. So she asked this question, how do you know if your relationship has evolved into an emotional affair? And here are some of her key points to recognizing an emotional affair. When most meetings and conversations are kept secret from your partner. When you say and do things with someone you would never do in front of your spouse. When you make a point to arrange private talk time with them. And when you share things with them that you don't with your partner. And this is called windows and walls. There's just an appropriateness to any relationship that you have outside of your marriage with a person of the opposite sex. And windows means I'm having a conversation with my assistant. I'm having a conversation with a woman at church or a woman at work or something like that. And we have a closeness to our relationship, either a physical proximity of working together or we have a friendship that we've developed. And all of a sudden I find myself wanting to say something to her about the state of my marriage or my feelings or something that I know I shouldn't say. Well, when I say it, I'm opening a window that is not a normal window. This is intimate conversation. At exactly the same time I do that, because I'm not going to tell my spouse, I built a wall with my spouse. The more I share here, the bigger the window gets. The more I share here, the bigger the wall here gets. And so she says in an emotional affair, that precedes it. It always precedes it in an emotional affair. And then she asks these questions to qualify whether we're having an emotional affair. Do you avoid telling your partner how much time you spend or talk with the other person? Do you tell this person more about your day than your partner? Do you even tell him or her about your marital dissatisfaction, which is a huge warning sign? Do you ready your appearance to see them? Is there a sexual attraction, spoken or unspoken, between you? Now, let me say this now. There was a book that was written to women. I think it was called Intimate Issues by Lorraine Pentis and Linda Dillow. And very good book for women, Christian book. And they asked women, Christian women, how many of you have been attracted outside of your marriage to a man other than your husband? And 93% of Christian women said they had been attracted to another man, and the other 7% are lying like dogs. Because every person, men and women, it's just so ridiculous to say, oh, I've never been tempted. Like, of course you have. There's a sexual attraction there. Okay? Well, you got to be careful, because that's going to happen. It's going to happen with people close up, and it's going to happen far away. And this is the reason that you have to build the right boundaries in your relationship. Here's one other question. Would you feel guilty if your partner saw you together? Would you be talking if your partner was here like you are without them being there? Would you be showing affection the same way? And if you're not, it's inappropriate. And she says, to get out of the emotional affair, stop flirting. Listen, if you're a flirt, it's inappropriate. You shouldn't flirt with people. It's just wrong. Stay out of high-risk places, she says. You know what those are. When you're alone, when you're having private time with that individual, wherever that is, break off the relationship totally, she says. And it's interesting, her suggestion is turn your heart back. Turn your heart back. Here's another detail that I'll go through very quickly of how an affair goes from emotional to physical. And these are 12 steps. I'll just read through these. Now, I want you to listen to the first one, though. The first step of an affair going from emotional to physical, listen to it, something makes you lean away from your marriage. Isn't that an interesting point? Turn your heart away. There's an awareness of another person. Innocent meetings with that person open the door for flirting. Meetings become intentional and planned by one of the people. While in a group setting, the two people linger together in conversation. Conversation shifts to feelings. The two people have isolated meetings under the disguise of a legitimate purpose. The two people have isolated meetings for pleasure. Embraces become affectionate and playful touching begins. Embraces become passionate. Adultery happens. And then finally, number 12 is the affair is made public. And so my first point, and I'm going to make my second point very quickly. My first point is don't turn your heart away. Here's my second point. Be sensitive to your spouse's emotional needs and meet them. And let me make this point now in just a few minutes, and I'm finished. I'm going to keep my heart turned toward you, but I can't meet all your needs. God has to meet some of your needs, but there are needs that I need to meet, and some emotional needs that I need to meet. Men and women are different. Men's basic needs are honor, sex, friendship, and domestic support. Women's basic needs are security, open and honest communication, non-sexual touching and affection, and leadership. We're different, but those are our basic needs. But we have a mega need. When we talk about those needs, we have an emotional mega need that is more important than all the others. And for men, it's respect. And for women, it's security. Very, very important. So how do affairs happen? A selfish man, a dishonoring woman offend each other, hurt each other, don't meet each other's needs. And because we're now wounded and hurt and disillusioned, our hearts turn away. And we're both vulnerable to somebody else meeting the needs that are being unmet. And that can happen on one side and that can happen on both sides. Well, how do you keep affairs from happening? You commit yourself to loving your spouse and meeting their emotional needs. and you commit yourself not to turning your heart away, even if you're going through difficult times. When your marriage needs you the most is when you're going through difficult times. When your spouse needs you the most is when they're going through a worse or a poorer or a sicker time. And don't you listen to the devil's accusations that it can never be good again, or it could never be resurrected. Your marriage is doomed. Absolutely not. Every marriage can be resurrected, but we have to keep working on it. We have to keep trusting God for it. And that only happens in an atmosphere where we're truly committed. And true commitment says, I will never leave you or forsake you.